Originally, I had no plans to make this video, but after crunching some numbers and seeing this stat, I did a double take. Wait a minute, is the problem with Jiaoqiu just the way that Vuln works? Let me explain. On its own, vulnerability isn't a bad multiplier. However much vulnerability you have, that's how much more damage you do. 100% vulnerability equals 100% more damage. Very straightforward. However, because vulnerability has a very simple linear scaling, every time you increase the vulnerability you start with, the lower the final damage multiplier for adding the same amount of vulnerability. As you can see here, adding 45% Vuln when you don't have any gives an expected 1.45 times final damage multiplier, but when you start with 50%, adding that same 45% Vuln drops the multiplier down to 30%, or 1.3 times. That means when your vulnerability is high, you'll want to start investing into other non-diluted multipliers, such as Defense Shred and Res Pen, since they start becoming stronger point for point over Vuln. And as you can see, these numbers weren't picked out of thin air. Jiaoqiu and Topaz both have 50% Vuln in their base kits. Pure Fiction also makes enemies 50% more vulnerable, and actually Apocalyptic Shadow has this number even higher at 100% when you break, which presents an even worse case for stacking vulnerability as seen in this example. And well, 45% Defense Shred only consists of Silver Wolf's ult, and can get even higher if adding more sources of Defense Shred, like her Defense Shred bug for an extra 8%, or Pearls for an extra 16%. Combines with the fact that Defense Shred provides a higher and higher damage multiplier the more of it you stack, instead limited by its 100% cap, and we arrive at the conclusion that E0S1 Cipher with 40% Vuln and 24% Defense Shred gains less with E0S1 Jiaoqiu, who gives an extra 74% Vuln per ult, over Pearl's Pela, who only gives an extra 58% Defense Shred. Of course, as you can see, this only holds versus level 95 enemies in MOC, as Defense Shred gets stronger with higher level enemies who have more defense, and weaker with lower level enemies who have less. Add any additional source of Vuln though, like Hyacine's 18% on her S1, and all of a sudden Pearl's Pela beats out Jiaoqiu in all scenarios. This gets even worse when factoring in the 50% vulnerability you get in Pure Fiction. Quick disclaimer, of course, screenshot numbers often fall to the wayside when compared to actual utility. Jiaoqiu is usually still better than Pela, due to his Vuln being actually permanent, and his ability to add an Akron stack every enemy turn. Enemy turns might happen more often than you think, by the way. However, I hope this serves to illustrate that 50% Vuln is still shockingly low compared to what modern supports give us today, supports that also have their own utility on top of more damage amp. So mostly for my own sake of understanding, let's look at the history of vulnerability, and see if we can figure out its place in the meta. Upon the game's initial release, vulnerability was a rare stat and used quite conservatively. Only 3 characters had it. Himiko's Vuln was attached to a technique and only applied a 10% fighter vulnerability debuff for the first 2 turns of every wave. I will say though, for having essentially no opportunity cost, it is nice despite being both specific and small, and even today can situationally outrank certain dimension techniques like Robin's and Jiaoqiu's. Welt had a 12% Vuln attached to his ult for 2 turns, fitting into his Jack-of-all-trades, Master-of-None playstyle. A nice bonus, especially considering that you could play dual DPS with him and win Dang Hung at the time. But realistically, you were mainly playing him for his slows, his CCs, or his high multipliers. 12% Vuln was just a cherry on top. Sampo actually had a meaningful amount of Vuln on his ult, 30% for all DOTs for 2 turns at level 10. Equal to 47% Defense Shred on its own, this actually meant that his amp was higher than Pela's, provided you played a dot team. Considering that he and Serval were the only real dot units at the time though, this wasn't all too impactful outside of his own damage at the time. At the outset, we can see here how Vuln was low impact, either being limited in duration, power, and scope. Later on, in 1.0 and 1.1, 2 more characters would technically get access to vulnerability, but this didn't really matter that much. Qingyuan got it on his E6, with a stacking 12% Vuln per Lightning Lord hit, capping at 36% and disappearing after Lightning Lord's attack. For a 10-hitter, this would average to 32.4% Vuln. Honestly, pretty decent for a version 1's DPS E6, but obviously nowhere near today's standards, and out of sight, out of mind for 99.99% of the player base. Silverwolf, on the other hand, got access to 12% vulnerability from her S1. While this might seem great on paper, the 53% defense down she herself could stack, with her ult and bug, meant that an S5 copy of Pearls would offer slightly more damage, not to mention that 4-piece Quantum further pushed disadvantage. Granted, Pearls didn't come up right up until Kafka's Banner, and lower superpositions than S5 not only possess smaller defense shred, but a much lower base chance to land a debuff in the first place. Incessant Rain came with that 100% base chance with no extra superimpositions, as well as 24% effect hit rate, extra base stats, and 12% crit rate if you really want to spec into DPS Silverwolf. Still though, if you really wanted personal damage from Silverwolf, building Break for a potential 100k HP entanglement nukes was an equally viable option. Not to mention that said playstyle worked better with Tutorial, her free-to-play event like Cone that provided her with much faster ult rotations and was recognized even back then as potentially best in slot over her S1. Nowadays, with sub-DPS Silverwolf pretty much dead, yeah, her signature has aged like milk. Tutorial's energy regen is better for overall gameplay and can be S5 for free. Pearl's is better for amp, especially considering that if you want to use Incessant Rain on any other Nihility, the 12% Vuln is a single target application versus Pearl's is AoE. The only time you'd even consider it is if you hit the 100% defense shred cap and Pearl's does nothing, which shouldn't happen without lots of vertical investment. I should know, it's happened to me. This isn't really an optimal team either, despite my inner copium that tries to justify that signature pull every few months. Just after this point is where vulnerability started becoming less rare and more practical, with the introduction of Kafka in version 1.2 and the beginning of the DOT archetype. Kafka herself actually didn't really have vulnerability in her base kit, just 30% dot vulnerability attached to her single target follow-up at E1. However, Sampo, who was already in the roster, plus Luca, who was introduced with her, did. His ult applied a single target 20% vuln for 2 turns, which theoretically could be used by anyone, but was often relegated to himself and his fellow DOT squadron, as he liked Kafka retriggering both his skill and break leads. Pela, Tingyan, Asta, Branya, and Silverwolf all outclassed him in both amp and utility, and unless the enemy was physical weak, his bleeds weren't really doing all that much. Soon after, in version 1.4, we would get our final DOT 4 started date in the form of Guinaifen. On base, she provided a maximum of 21% vuln, ramping up from 0 by 7% each time enemies took burn damage, up to 3 times. The stackable debuff, Fire Kiss, was better than Luca's vulnerability in 4 major ways. 1. Ease of uptime. Applying burn wasn't tied to her ultimate, but rather to her basic and skill, and only needed a burn proc once every 3 enemy turns to be maintained. 2. Ease of application. Her skill allowed for blast burns, and her ult plus Kafka's ult could AoE re-trigger those burns. 3. This buff was unremovable, meaning that it couldn't be removed by enemy cleanses or, more importantly, phase changes. 4. At E6, Guinaifen would get to stack Fire Kiss 1 extra time, for a total of 4 times. Combined with the additional talent levels at E5, this would bring her vuln up to 30.4%. The idea of 30.4% generic vuln was so tempting that she was even considered as a potential strong generic support at E6. But needing to wait 4 enemy turns, her full amp without a Kafka team, right when the 3-star requirement became the 10-cycle standard we know today, meant that realistically she wasn't going to see good returns on Fire Kiss without Kafka to speed up the process. If Luca's single target debuff application was too slow for general use, then Guinaifen's, which needed ramp-up time, wasn't particularly good either. Of course though, Guinaifen wasn't the only new fire character with vulnerability in her kit. The limited 5-star on her banner, and the first character that really put vulnerability on the map was the much anticipated, highly awaited
Topaz from the Special Dead Martial Force.
When generic sources of vulnerability lay in the 10 to 20% range, only reaching as high as 30% but with restrictions attached, Topaz's jaw-dropping 50% single target vulnerability for all follow-ups had players wildly speculating. Here was a character who had offered never-before-seen levels of damage amp at the time, with her entire kit benefiting from her own amplification. Sure, she didn't do the most damage, but she did enough, and everything from her attack frequency to her E1 and S1, providing more team-wide damage boost, promised potential with future follow-up attackers. At the moment, she didn't really have anyone to fully capitalize on her single target debuffs, which made her quote-unquote balanced. Jinyuan was blast bounce, Clara was a counter unit, meaning she switched targets often, and Blade's follow-ups were AoE. And well, Yanqing's follow-ups usually didn't hit that hard. Let's check up on how her future potential holds a little bit later and return to DOT for now. Now at this point, DOT has an ideal set structure. You have Kafka, your 4-star DOT sub DPS, your support, ideally providing AoE buffs, and your sustain, ideally Huohuo. Having multiple DOT sub DPS was suboptimal for two main reasons. One, they only retrigger DOTs of their own element, and two, it's really hard to play with 3 DOT units all being on element. 3, as mentioned before, multiple sources of vulnerability don't amp damage all too well. Rather than play any combination of Sampo, Luca, and Guinaifen together, it was better to pair one of them with an AoE buffer, or just go all in on Kafka with hypercarry buffers like Silverwolf, Tingen, or Branya. Of course, not all accounts would have had enough supports available to justify this playstyle, lest their second team suffer. This was about to change with the introduction of Black Swan. Black Swan directly incentivizes as many DOTs as possible to build up her own Arcana stacks super fast. She didn't want Defense Shred supports because at E0S1 with the Prisoner Relic set, she hit almost 90% Defense Shred already, making Vuln supports better than Defense Shred supports due to overcapping. She also worked in tandem with Kafka, having a roughly 2-to-1 damage split, so hypercarry focused supports like Tingen and Branya were usually out of the equation too. However, you look at her ult and realize she has 25% Vuln too. Actually, wait, it's not that much. Outside of enemy turns, plus the downtime Black Swan's Vuln naturally possess, that 25% Vuln isn't really saturating anything. Still though, how are we 4 for 6 with DOT units having vulnerability in their base kit? 4 out of 5 if not counting Serval. Anyways, that's nice and all, but why implement a 4-star DOT sub DPS with all these fancy synergies when Ron Mei exists? She's such a powerful AoE support that you're genuinely better off running her with Kafka and Swan over a dedicated 4-star DOT unit. Even if not using Ron Mei though, especially considering her high demand on every single team at this point, the Kafka Black Swan core itself is already so powerful that you can even do just fine just running someone else like Asta, especially when equipping Kafka's S1 to make applying 3 dots for Prisoner's full effect to proc easier. And even without, Asta's basics also have a chance to burn. And let's just say a very special attack buffer who also buffed team damage percent and replaced Asta's team-wide speed buff for a whole turn would be coming soon. Yeah, this is where vulnerability numbers being so low starts to really hurt the users who rely on it as their only source of amp. Up to this point, vulnerability has been a bonus stat, supplemented by other mechanics. In Dot's case, that's the ability to re-trigger dots as well as provide personal dot damage of one's own. However, the 4-star dot units with both supportive and defensive capabilities have had both qualities nerfed for the sake of balance, and probably also for being early 4-stars. So when a limited 5-star Harm-ony comes around, with way bigger supportive numbers and better beneficial mechanics, all the extra synergy those dot units have is ultimately rendered meaningless. They just don't have the numbers to compete. Really, why bother with a unit whose entire kit centers around synergizing with DOT when you can just use a limited Harm-ony that provides miles better damage without being archetype specific? Now let's go back to Topaz, shall we? Some astute viewers might have noticed that I skipped over Dr. Ratio to finish talking about Dot, who should by all rates be the exact follow-up DPS that Topaz needed. His kit is single target, most of his damage relies on follow-ups, and Topaz can even easily trigger multiple attacks after Ratio ults to unleash his 2 follow-up charges as fast as possible. Just one problem. Topaz's vulnerability is a single debuff. See, Ratio needs 3 debuffs to have a 100% chance of triggering a follow-up on his skill, and 5 to maximize his A6 trace for 50% bonus damage. Let's put aside that A6 for now, because it really isn't that important at the moment, and focus on the 3 debuffs requirement instead. Topaz provides exactly 1 debuff, or 2 with her S1. Spending 2 limited pulls to still have a 20% chance for Ratio to whiff his follow-ups is not a pleasant feeling, especially when Pela with Pearls, a 4-star support with the 4-star Lycone, which, by the way, was also rated up on Topaz's Lycone banner, does not run into this issue. Pela's technique, 20% defense down on all enemies at the start of battle for 2 turns. There's 1 debuff. Her ult, online by turn 1 on all enemies and pretty much permanent afterwards, adding a 2nd debuff. And finally, Pearls, which most players should have by now, adds a 3rd debuff to all her attacks. Oh, and when Pela's technique debuffs Inspires, her skill can add another debuff at E4 to replace it. Now here's the issue. An E5 Pela with S5 Pearls provides 58% defense shred. When paired with an E0-S1 ratio, was 24% defense shred, referred to the else calculations of ratio as S0, she provides them with a 55% damage increase against level 95 enemies. That's 5% more than Topaz on follow-ups and 45% more on skills and ults. Okay, sure, Ratio's S1 doesn't proc a 24 defense shred until he uses his ult. Well then remember Pela's 20% defense shred technique? Boom! 71.6% total damage increase on Ratio's first turn for going from 0 to 78% defense shred rather than from 24 to 82%. Not to mention that Ratio's A6 trace only starts extra damage if 3 or more debuffs are on the target, so that's another 30% damage bonus for running Pela on the team over Topaz. All of this can mean that even factoring in Topaz's personal damage, the gap between Pela and Topaz isn't as far off as one might think. Not to mention that Pela's debuffs are AoE, and to make up for not having a summon for more attacks, she has a faster ult rotation, plus the frequency is 4-piece eagle due to not caring about a good crit ratio and having very low EHL requirements. Also, Ratio only needs 2 attacks per ult, so maintaining that requirement isn't really too hard in the first place. And well, if you want to use Tutorial Silverwolf instead, implanting an off-element weakness for 10% all-type res pen paired with just a defense shred from her ult and talent results in a 63% damage increase and a 53.5% damage increase for non-follow-ups. If Silverwolf implants an imaginary weakness against a standard 20% res non-weak enemy, well guess what? That's just over a 2 times damage multiplier and still a hefty increase for non-follow-ups. She also has no problem single-handedly satisfying Ratio's A6 trace by herself, so add another 50% damage on top of that. And well, if you give her pearls, and include the 3% extra all-type res pen from 3+ debuffs when using her skill, that's somewhere around 2.5 times the original damage. Overall, this gives Silverwolf 11 to 63% more amp than Topaz, depending on the scenario you bring her to. I hope this goes to show just how strong defense shred stacking is over Vuln, especially when paired with alongside another multiplier like Res Pen, and especially versus resistant enemies. Oh, but surely Topaz ekes out ahead in terms of sheer attack frequency because of Robin, right? Plus, she does way more personal damage thanks to amazing synergy with Robin too, and keeps Robin energy full for more reliable ult uptime. Well, note that anyone can take advantage of Silverwolf's debuffs, so since the L sections are calculated assuming no buffs on Ratio, Robin's personal damage can also see the same increase. Just replace imaginary with physical weakness for these assumptions. And as for the energy issue, Gallagher has quid pro quo to keep Robin's energy full even if you don't have Huohuo. He's also a great SP generator and debuff applier, so actually he does synergize quite well with Topaz by funding her skills and ults, plus covering for her lack of debuffs too. But Slot and Pela, Silverwolf, or even Tingyun with this team, and witness Ratio spam enough follows to bankrupt a university. Sure, Topaz works just fine, but she's still a functional side grade to all these units at E0, not to mention E0 S1, just because her 50% Vuln is not strong enough. I guess you could pair with Aventurine to really capitalize on her follow-ups, and even equip as S1 for more consistent debuffs, but guess what other stat is on Aventurine's S1? Yep, Vuln. Not that this matters that much, but that 10% Vuln is now only a 6.7% final damage upgrade for follow-ups, which feels pretty bad as 10% isn't even that much to start with. See this pattern of mechanically synergistic but diluted and effective damage because Hoyo can't give Vuln characters truly competitive amp a rise again? Sure, Ratio is best comp is RRAT if you bother to spend a cost on E0 S1 for everyone I guess, but then Hoyo forgot about balance and made Robin E1 able to replace 3 S1s and even 2 characters through raw damage alone. Notice a theme yet? And actually, while we're on the topic of Gallagher, let's talk about the real archetype where everyone else got to know him. I'll have a backloaded archetype that can't crit, and really wants 1 enabler plus Ron Mei. How original. And with every support packing vulnerability. Daring today, aren't we? Yeah, I said before that Break is just DOT but better, but I genuinely did not realize how similar these archetypes truly are. The only exception is that instead of Kafka being mandatory, it's Ron Mei and Harm-ony MC, I guess, but they're free and have no real competition. Yet, that's a problem for 3.0 to worry about. To cut right to the chase, here's a list of how much break vulnerability all the relevant break supports have. Out of all these stats, so let's highlight some particularly interesting examples. Apparently, Hoyo thought the 24% break fall on Firefly's S1 was so overtuned that they had to nerf its attack to that of a 4-star light cone. This is the only time in history, someone correct me if I'm wrong, that a 5-star light cone has ever had its base attack nerfed to be lower than that of a Herta Shop light cone for an attack scaling DPS. And yes, Blaze S1 has more base attack than Aeon. Check for yourself if you don't believe me. And if 5-star light cone spiking in base attack starting with Dills was concerning, this is frankly hilarious. I guess that much Vuln is still an 18% increase with Gallagher, but Jarvis, pull up the Pridwin calc showing the increase in Jinglius and Ratio's S1s. Obligatory reminder that damage checks on Pridwin are not to be taken as fact. I am only using their data points as sanity checks that a lot of limited DPSs with non-mechanic changing S1s, basically not Acherons, all have roughly equal power level with their S1s versus without. However, keep in mind that because ratios and Jiaoqiu signatures have defense shred, their potential to be even better than their free-to-play alternatives goes up with defense shred supports. Meanwhile, for Firefly, that potential only goes down, making it worse than its peers. Sure, that means Firefly is more free-to-play friendly if you want to spin it that way, but this comparison will compound with a few other trends later to show something I'm not really a fan of. The same problem of Vuln dilution is true for Linxia. 18% Vuln on an S1 is nice, but after factoring in her 25% break Vuln on ult, it's only a 14.4% final damage increase. On Rappa, who only has 8% Vuln, it's a 13.5% final damage increase. With Boothill's 30% self Vuln, it drops to 11.6%, and with Firefly's 20% Vuln, it's 12.4%, but with their S1 equipped, that drops all the way to 10.7%. You are better off pulling this S1 for non-break teams, like genuinely. That way you can actually see the full 18% final damage increase it seems to give. Just don't run it with Topaz, I guess. And speaking of Rappa, why does she only give everyone 8% break Vuln? Sure, she can actually dual DPS with Boothill and Firefly, concerningly well on sustainless teams even if some may call it wheelchairing them to the finish line. But that doesn't change the fact that on a break team especially, 8% Vuln is cosmetic. Maybe it'll save you from the curse of 1%, but in reality, it's just a small incentive to push you to get that S1 for more attack, if the prospect of it being 2 eagles in a light cone when the best next option only gives a purple boot's worth of speed somehow wasn't convincing enough. And then Fugue S1. Finally, a light cone with the appropriate amount of vulnerability to potentially make the pull justified. While you might not always see the full 36% vulnerability most of the time because, well, if you break 2 toughness bar, the enemy tends to die shortly after, it is not lost on me that at peak performance, this is almost as much Vuln as Linxia's and Firefly's S1 combined. That's not even mentioning how Linxia runs a real opportunity cost by foregoing energy-based light cones like the selfless quid pro quo, or the selfish post-op conversation, Rekka's signature, or Luocha's S1 for those true abundance enjoyers. Of course, I am in no way insinuating that Fugue with her S1 is more damage than Linxia's and Firefly's S1s combined, especially when Pearls exists. And actually, on that note, let's see how much of an upgrade Fugue S1 really is over S5 Pearls. Remember that Break DPS all have access to 4-piece cavalry, which is 10% defense shred for Break and 25% for Super Break, so the comparison might be closer than you think. I'll be underlining the stats that I believe represent the most realistic vertical investment, but of course your count might be different, and the stats I'm about to show don't account for all possible cases of investment. They do account for a lot of them though. For Rappa, the most straightforward case with only 8% break Vuln, Fugue S1 isn't really a worthwhile increase over Pearls at all until the second break. In fact, if you only break once, Fugue's S1 loses to S5 Pearls. Still though, as Rappa wants to be breaking as many times as possible, Fugue's S1 handily comes out on top. For Boothill, who gains lots of defense shred from his S1, Pearls benefits him a bit more than it does Rappa. However, he can end up overcapping on defense shred with too many Eidolons, especially with his S1, and at that point, Pearls provides no damage increase, making Fugue S1 the obvious winner. As for Firefly, the immense amount of Vuln saturation, especially with Linxia, means that Pearls has a higher comparative advantage, especially if you start stacking Eidolons. She's actually in the same spot defense shred-wise as Rappa, but way more players have vertical investment in Firefly, hence me simulating for more scenarios for her overall too. This means that on average, you're more likely to overcap on defense shred with her than you are with the Cosmic Ninja. So overall, Fugue's S1, despite what I said about it having lots of vulnerability, doesn't really look too great, especially when her E1 exists. It just straight outclasses her S1 in every scenario, not just with Firefly too. And when you consider that Vuln continues to get weaker and weaker with vertical investment, while defense shred only gets stronger and stronger, up to a point, it makes more sense to go all in on defense shred until you can't. Well, of course, there is the fact that Fugue's E1, unlike her team-wide S1, is single target, and if we all know anything, break supports can put in their fair share of work. So, how does Linxia also benefiting from Fugue's E1 change the E1 over S1 evaluation? Not that much. Remember that Linxia herself suffers from the Vuln saturation problem the hardest alongside Firefly, which she also passes on to her teammates. Even when considering the dual DPS boost to both break sub DPS and Linxia that Fugue S1 could provide over her E1, it's not really a battle between whether her S1 or E1 is better. E1 wins, high diff. It's more like a battle between your wallet and winning your next 50-50. And that's not exactly a throwaway joke either. When comparing vulnerability to defense shred, 3 Lycons in the break archetype, only one of which is self-age boosts Vuln. Only a single break Lycon boosts defense shred. Then you look at the Eidolons. There is only one break Eidolon that boosts vulnerability, and it's on Boot Hill's E4. In my opinion, you can also tell how little they cared about this Eidolon too, because even after its damage reduction effect, Boot Hill still takes 3% more damage in standoff. Like, really, Hoyo? Could you really not have bothered to raise both stats to 15%? And before you say that, well, pretty much all E4s are useless. Break is no exception. One, that proves the point, seeing as how the only vulnerability Eidolon is on a useless E4, but also two, look at E4 Fugue. Despite how it is worded, it is not a vulnerability Eidolon. For some reason, E4 Fugue is actually a true 1.2 times multiplier that is separate from vulnerability, even though it is worded exactly like vulnerability. Because of this, it actually beats the trend of useless E4s and is recognized as good. In fact, it's even better than 20% true damage because you can actually multiply it with true damage. That is how I know vulnerability for break teams is cooked. So with all that said, how many defense shred Eidolons are there for contrast? Oh. Isn't it nice that they're all on E1s too, to really entice easy spending? Not only that, but as mentioned before, they are literally designed to have a compounding effect with each other. The more of them you pair together, the better they work. Oh, and the overcap I mentioned before, so long as you aren't trying to get by with pearls, it's actually a non-issue. It's not a coincidence that E1 Firefly and E1 Rappa on Cavalry, with E1 Linksha, E1 Ron Mei, and Fugue's Foxy and Prayer, hits 83% defense shred on breaks and 98% on super breaks. E1 Cavalry Boot Hill with E1 Ron Mei, E1 Sunday, and Fugue's Foxy and Prayer is only slightly lower, hitting 80% defense shred on breaks and 95% on super breaks. But, funnily enough, equip his S1, and his breaks, which are his main source of damage, become perfectly capped at 100% defense shred. Absolute cinema. This perfection has to be calculated. They even tailored the endgame buffs to match. Boot Hill skilled in my head, name one endgame buff that has had vulnerability in any capacity, I'm going off like Eminem. But name one endgame buff with defense shred? Wait, what's that? Fugue E3 adds an extra 2% defense shred? So let me get this straight. The 2 break DPS that optimally run Linksha at high investment as a second break sub DPS hit 100% defense shred on their own super breaks on the way to E6 Fugue, who boosts everyone's weakness break efficiencies. But is it needed for Boot Hill, who is the only real toughness reducer on his team and thus cares less about Fugue past E2? Dear Dawe, it's worse than I thought. And unlike Vuln, which usually has mediocre to non-existent bonuses to offset their amp, these defense shred Eidolons also come with really nice stuff. Firefly's E1 comes with making her SP economy better than Xingliu, pre-buffs, in case I have to clarify. Rappa's E1 also improves their energy rotation, which isn't always necessary, but when you need it, oh boy will you appreciate it. Boot Hill's E1 makes it way easier for him to ramp up stacks, and sure, with Fugue it's less of a necessity, but don't forget that 50% toughness reduction still lets him double break and gain stacks even faster. Plus, now you don't even have to score a kill to cap out at Greek Pocket trick shots in one shot anymore. Linksha also has 50% weakness break efficiency attached to her E1, so she can steal ally breaks even harder and become the true DPS. Ron Mei doesn't have any extra bells and whistles, but bringing 20% defense shred anywhere you also bring a limited 5-star Harm-ony is enough value in and of itself. Eidolons are more expensive and exclusive than Lycones, we all know this by now. Not only is a 50-50 worse than a 75-25, but the pity for characters is also 10 higher. So imagine choosing the safer option and going for S1s instead of E1s on your Linksha, your Fugue, your Firefly, only to realize that even though your vulnerability is at a sky-high 123%, you still run into SP issues, you can't break as fast as the E1 Fugue owners, and overall your Linksha S1 will be better off with Gallagher on the other team. Heck, I don't even think Boot Hill is that worse off now getting E1 over S1 with the existence of Shadow by Night, though honestly you'd want both E1 and S1, especially if you're chasing high-octane sustainless runs nowadays. Rappa's the only character who truly wants her S1 over her E1, but ironically she's also the most dependent on her Sig and Fugue. That's why, in the wise words of Ruri Goko,
the only way to increase this team damage is first, you pull for Eidolon. Second, you pull for Eidolon. And third, you pull for Eidolon. And maybe the last is you pull for this type of Lycoon. You can like dump all your stamina somewhere else. You save up some money, then you pull. This is pretty much the only way to increase break team damage.
So don't just take my word for it. If a Hoyo creator who isn't afraid to voice their honest thoughts like Ruri says it this plainly, then you know it's bad. Break Eidolons are premium, and the almost complete absence of Vuln in them contrasts starkly with the ubiquitous presence of Defense Shred. I haven't even talked about how terrible locking weakness break efficiency behind Fugue E1 is. That rant could honestly be its own video. And finally, we have come full circle. Jiaoqiu, 35% unconditional permanent Vuln on all enemies, 50% if using ults. The most honest, no-nonsense, full uptime Vuln support to exist in the game. However, that's all he has, besides one obvious corner case, and if you want to compare him to Ranmei as a generic Amper, it suddenly doesn't look so great for our Foxian friend. At E0S0, Ranmei's 68% damage and 25% res pen only provide less than a 50% increase versus 0 res enemies, basically her worst case scenario overall, if your DPS is already at 250% damage. And remember, this is only comparing ults and before Ranmei's 68% damage boost, meaning your DPS would actually have to show 318% in battle with her to break even. Change that enemy to a non-weak one with 20% res, and now for Jiaoqiu to pull ahead, your DPS has to have over 444% damage, which is an unreasonably high breakpoint even by modern standards. Even with Acheron already giving herself 20% res pen on her ult, plus having huge self-damage steroids, she needs both a lightning damage percent orb and her S1, which, mind you, is suboptimal since she prefers attack orb if Robin isn't there. And well, yeah, if you set it to be that favorable, then congrats, Ranmei provides only effective 49.6% Vuln. Jiaoqiu's like less than 1% better. Of course, there is a factor of permanent uptime to consider, but you know you can just time your Acheron ults to match Ranmei's ult uptime, or use some of many ways to cheat out energy or ult uptime that exists with like Lycone selection and smart play nowadays, the easiest and most consistent being to just use Ranmei's ult during her own turn. Plus, even if you oversimplify things and cut Ranmei's ult contribution by 2/3 to simulate her average uptime, then yeah, even for an optimal E0S1 Acheron with an attack orb, having a 146% damage bonus, Ranmei still provides effective 45.4% Vuln. You might find yourself asking at this point, why compare Ranmei to Jiaoqiu in an Acheron team? Doesn't Acheron have a trace that makes swapping Jiaoqiu for Ranmei come at the cost of 39.1% of her final damage multiplier? Indeed, but I'd like to ask you, how many DPS are ult focused and can practically reach 250% damage on their ult with just 2 supports in Ranmei? Not that many. Argenti's the only one, actually. With his S1, he has 153% damage with Scholar, Salsodo, Physical Damage Orb, and his S1, and paired with Tingyun and Robin, this goes up to 259%. Replace Tingyun with E0S1 Sunday, and it's a bit higher at 278%. However, he's literally the only practical case other than Acheron, and this is a sustainless team we're talking about. Xingqiu's damage is focused on her enhanced basics, Anax is on his skills, Casters and Hyacines don't have damaging ultimates, and even Triby's massive 216% damage steroid isn't enough. Not to mention that she also has Vuln in her kit, making Jiaoqiu's amp less effective for her in the first place. And remember, this is just on a damage comparison basis. Ranmei also provides 10% speed to everyone but herself, 50% weakness break efficiency, as well as a delay to keep enemies broken for longer. And remember, broken enemies take 11.1% more damage, expressed as its own multiplier. So there's a more hidden damage that I didn't include with using her as well. What utility does Jiaoqiu have outside of Acheron teams? Breaking fire toughness, I guess, but that's relevant versus like Choir, Bananas, and Sunday. And guess who really helps Jiaoqiu for 2 out of those 3 bosses? Adding his own dots is nice, but until they get the SU or E2's power spike, they don't hit very hard. And, well, going back to dot teams, sure, 0 ramp-up time makes them upgrade from Gui Ninethin, but not enough to beat out someone like Robin or Ranmei in the 3rd slot. Kafka's ult triggers sadly do not cause dots to gain the extra 15% Vuln from ults, meaning that he's contributing a whopping 35% Vuln to the team. Damn. At least, Black Swan likes S1 as his best in slot. Multiple Jiaoqiu's S1s can also stack. However, one, that's a whale solution, and two, you've already heard me talk about Vuln saturation, but let's briefly touch on it one more time. His S1 is another 24% Vuln as long as you inflict dot. That high of a number makes it better than Pearl's off rip, but if E0 S1 Firefly with E0 S0 Lingsha was already starting to saturate at 69% Vuln, imagine how it feels to have 59% Vuln and 74% Vuln for ults only. At least Firefly and other break DPS have defense shred, relics, supports, and eidolons at relatively accessible spender levels. Gosh, that feels so wrong to say out loud. You want another Vuln multiplier for a Jiaoqiu? Sure, 40% damage at E1, I guess, and 27% res pen and 32.2% more Vuln. At E6. Congrats, you're now the strongest general amper in the game, I think. It's not even whale bait at this point. If you have E6 Jiaoqiu, you're either a Leviathan, a proud male enjoyer, very cool, or most likely both. But for the rest of us down-to-earth mortals, that 74% Vuln at E0 S1 poses a huge problem. Cipher and Jiaoqiu were supposed to be E0 Acheron's best nihilities, and they probably still will be, mechanically. Effortless uptime plus rapid Acheron stack generation on yours and your enemy's turns is great. But riddle me this, why is it that by pulling Cipher's S1, and thus allowing me to run Pearls on my second nihility, which I should be doing anyways because S1 is really important for debuff generation, that Jiaoqiu is now being out-amped by Pela? Why does 40% Vuln plus 24% defense shred at E0 S1, Cipher, make defense shred better than Vuln? Somehow adding bigger Vuln to bigger Vuln is less damage than adding smaller defense shred to smaller defense shred? So-called Vuln is point for point stronger than defense shred arguments, and just pair them both together arguments when you realize that when you do have both, defense shred starts beating out Vuln point for point as early as 43.1% on both, much earlier on than you might think. And it's not like Pela has zero utility either. That 20% defense down technique is still insanely good, and she can easily regen 1 to 2 turn ults versus Jiaoqiu's 3, solitary healing exceptions. In fact, it's because of this that she ends up playing better with ult and energy hungry supports like RMC and Trivy, letting her gain a potential advantage through team synergy. As such, versus slower bosses and tougher wave 1s, she has admittedly narrow but legit use cases over Jiaoqiu, and even more use cases outside of Acheron teams. To clarify, it's not a bad thing that sometimes 4 stars outclass 5 stars, and I do mean sometimes, not even close to all the time. That's just how making team comps can work out. What is bad though, in my opinion, is that these cases of 5 stars being outclassed almost exclusively involve Vuln-only supports. And as I've spent this whole video establishing, slapping a whole bunch of vulnerability on a kit and nothing else is the easiest way to cripple a character's meta viability, and Hoyo's done it at least twice. Not sure if anyone remembers this slide back from the Nihility rant, but let's return to this now. As mentioned before, Topaz with Ratio faced a problem where her amp was being beaten out by candidates such as Pela, Silverwolf Tingyan, and Robin's E1. Nowadays though, the problem with Topaz, notably now on Feixiao teams, is the opposite of Jiaoqiu's. Jiaoqiu has the best utility, but fights an uphill battle for amp. Topaz has the best amp, but fights an uphill battle for utility. Why? It's Eagle. It's always Eagle. Eagle Feixiao clears all other Feixiaos by a mile at all investment levels, and Topaz isn't built for that kind of playstyle. Why? Well, because Topaz has a natural 3-turn ult rotation when both March and Moza have as little as 2. It's because Topaz has no way of regaining energy outside of her own turn, and the 20 extra energy from her ult is offset by having a higher ult cost in the first place. Normal Nemi follow-ups generate 0 energy until E2, which I honestly feel is weird, like, why? Not only that, but Topaz has to make an SP negative rotation to even maintain said 3-turn ult without external energy. Compare that to Moza, who is fully SP neutral, and March, who is fully SP positive after her first skill. Even when considering that enhanced basics don't generate SP, she's still making 1 per enhanced basic rotation, which is quite frequent. And finally, Topaz doesn't have any advanced forwards herself to accelerate her energy rotation. Sure, Nami has 50%, but the Stoneheart herself pays in energy for making her Trotter do all the running around. Moza and March also have action advance at the start of battle, which even Numbi lacks, leading to better performance overall in low cycle clears. And guess what? Nami doesn't even advance forward for some reason if a follow-up is triggered right after his action. Gotta love unnecessary restrictions that sometimes end up hampering a character's defining mechanic, especially when others of the same thing just don't care. All of this, plus proof of debt, locking on randomly and needing an SP to reset, plus dealing less toughness in Apocalyptic Shadow, making her less appealing there, is what she sacrifices for 50% vulnerability. And yeah, we all know that March is a toughness machine, but let's not forget that Moza deals 10 toughness per single target follow-up when everyone else in the game is restricted to 5. Shadow Guard privileges, I guess. Luckily though, as we move into Amphorias, it seems like we're finally moving away from characters having vulnerability just for the sake of vulnerability. Call it Harm-ony privilege, but having permanent 30% vuln when mixed with 25% res pen is way better compared to her 30% vuln competition like Gwen Ifin and Sampo. Not much competition in that department, huh? But beyond them, not being a pure Amper helps her avoid the vuln saturation of Topaz and Jiaoqiu. But let's be real, those comparisons don't do her justice. Her real claim to fame is putting the harm in Harm-ony with refreshable AoE follow-up for AoE ult, boosted by her own amp plus 216% damage and 9% of the team's max HP. She also adds damage procs for enemy hit. Already, this makes her a sub-DPS menace for hit check fights and teams, especially in pure fiction, but add the fact that she also gains energy for enemy hit, and all of a sudden you have a capable DD spamming sub-DPS in your hands. And then you give her that S1 and all of a sudden you start questioning who the real DPS in the team is. Oh, and at E1 she gains the only source of true damage in the game that is capable of recording overkill, scaling harder with AoE, and offering the same amp as E1 Robin at worst. And just because, her ult field counts as a lingering debuff field like Jiaoqiu's, Black Swans, E2 Silverwolves, and E4 Acherons, meaning 1 extra debuff for ratio, and 1 Acheron stack every time mid-wave enemies spawn. Is she a support? Is she a DPS? Is she a tank? Would she nuke your house without mercy? Yes to all of the above. And even though Hyacinth has 18% vuln on her S1 like Lingsha's, well, her best team only has one other source of vuln, maybe 2 in some cases, but even then it's got other multipliers. And more importantly, if people are putting an extra Hyacinth stick on RMC when the vuln explicitly does not stack, meaning it provides 0 amp, just to trigger the HP drain effect, and it works, how am I supposed to complain about it? Plus, it's got 18% speed as a consolation prize. If anything, I think it's too good. And gating this mechanic behind a light cone, not to mention a debuff application per memo skill per Acheron teams, sets a concerning precedent. And look, I'd rag on Cipher's and Jiaoqiu's damage anti-synergy together, but Cipher herself has 40% vuln and 16 to 24% true damage that's storable at E0S0, and can actually run pearls okay, unlike Mr. 177.8% EHR for 40 res enemies for guaranteed debuffs or bust. 140 if you're being reasonable. And not only is her S1 pearls but more amp, but it's also 18% speed, AoE debuffs even on single target hits with a 120% base chance, 2 debuff instances for ratio, and refreshable debuffs for Acheron. Wait a minute, 18% speed, refreshable AoE debuffs, and said debuffs last for 2 turns? Didn't we review this light cone already? Anyways, to wrap everything up, vulnerability alone can't save niche or outdated mechanics, Topaz and eventually Jiaoqiu need buffs, DOT needs a revamp, Kafka buffs please be good, Break is an Eidolon check, and of course, 5-star harmonies are broken. Thanks for coming to my TED Talk. Okay, if you've somehow made it this far, thanks for watching, and also thanks so much for 1,000 subs. I never thought I'd hit this milestone, frankly speaking, but I'd love to keep going. With all that said, let me know what y'all thought of this video in the comments. Just as a heads up, most of them definitely won't be this long going forward. This could have been like 3 videos on its own, to be honest, but for 1,000 subs special, I thought the extra length was justified this time. Of course, let me know if there's anything you'd like me to cover next, and have a wonderful day.